Hello and welcome back to my channel. Now, since I last did a video, my subscriber rate has gone through the roof. It's been incredible. So I just want to welcome all the new subscribers who've come on board. You've got me over 2,000 subscribers. I'm really pleased. Thank you so much for joining. And to all my regular subscribers, thank you for your continued support. I'm a bit behind with answering all the comments at the moment, but I will get round to them. Now, I thought I'd take this opportunity to right a wrong. Many years ago, I did a video about the Amicus Portmanteau horror films. These were some films made in the 60s and 70s in Britain, where you had a series of little short stories, all put together by one overarching narrative. Now, in that video, I didn't include The Monster Club. Now, this came a bit later. It came in 1980, and it wasn't part of the official series, but it was made by one of the original producers, Milton Subotsky. And I didn't include it because I thought it was a bit rubbish. But, I watched it again recently, and I really want to talk about it because I have a lot of affection for this movie. But before we go any further, let's get one thing clear here. The Monster Club is one of the worst movies ever made. It is fantastically terrible. In fact, it's even trying to be a bad movie. So let's consider the evidence, right? It starts off, John Carradine, is it Carradine or Carradine? Anyway, John Carradine is looking very old, and he looks like he just wants to go home and have a nice nap. But anyway, so he's playing this horror writer called Chetwynd Hayes, and the three stories in the film are going to be based on Chetwynd Hayes' short stories, right? And he's outside a bookshop at night seeing whether his book is on sale, and he gets attacked by a vampire. The vampire turns out to be Vincent Price. Now, after they've had this rather horrible altercation, Vincent Price realises who his quarry is and apologises to him and offers to make it up to him. And he says, I'll take you to the Monster Club where all the monsters have their parties. So, yes, my friends, we are in the realm of comedy horror. Yeah, I know. I hate it as much as you do. Full of bad gags, this movie. Oh well, let's see where it takes us. So where it takes us is this club in this London basement that's full of the worst costumes you've ever seen, right? They're supposed to be monsters and they're dancing around in kids' outfits, but they look like really bad Halloween masks. That's the first problem. The second problem, right, this is a classic case of some middle-aged man producer in a cheap office in London saying, hey, what are those kids out there like? They like these modern beat combos, don't they? What's it called? Pop music. So let's have some pop music bands in between the stories. So what you get is, you get some modern musicians that those kids like out there doing actual rock numbers in between the songs. And they're terrible. Now, it says on the credits that UB40, yeah, red, red wine, UB40, that UB40 contributed to the music. But I can't really see in the movie where they are. I don't know if any of you out there know which song they contributed. But they're number one in the credits. I did recognise B.A. Robertson. He was a Scots singer in the 70s, and I sort of just recognised him. My memory banks just saw him, But the music is really, really terrible, right? Although, I have to be honest, ever since I watched the movie a few weeks ago, the song, Monsters Rule Okay, yeah, that's been going through my head. It's like an earworm. I can't get rid of it. And there's also, halfway through the movie, right, they put in this really sort of raunchy rock song, sort of nightclub song about being a stripper in a horror movie. It's so weirdly out of place. And then they do this kind of really bad animation where this kind of woman comes on stage as stripper and she starts disrobing and then she starts pulling off bits of her flesh and her arms. It's so weird. I mean, it's almost as if this movie is provoking you to find it the worst film you've ever seen. Incidentally, if you're a Doctor Who fan, I think the head of the Monster Club in a particularly bad mask is played by Roger Sloman, who was a scriptwriter on the John Pertwee years of Doctor Who. What are the chances of that? Anyway, then we go into the three stories. The middle story, yes, you've guessed it, it's a jokey comedy one. A really bad story, right? And the other thing about this movie that I cannot get my head around is how many brilliant actors it wastes. Poor old John Carradine is reduced to a spit and a cough. Donald Pleasance in the comedy story, it's an unbelievably cheap story. Donald Pleasance is a great actor, and he's got this comedy part as the head of the Bleeny squad, right? Not the Sweeney squad, but the Bleeny, to clean up vampires in London. What is Donald Pleasance doing? How much did they pay him? You know, Geoffrey Bayldon from Catweasel, he gets a spit in a goff, he gets 2 lines. Later, Patrick McGee, one of Britain's great character actors, turns up, and he gets 2 lines, and he slurs those lines because he's supposed to be a mad landlord. Britt Ekland gets a spit in a cough. What is going on? What kind of movie is this? Is there any other movie in the history of the planet that has wasted so many great actors or stars on nothing parts? It's unbelievably bad. And then just when you think it can't get any worse, right? At the end, they force poor old John Carradine to do some disco dancing. He looks so unhappy. You just want to give him a big hug. But you know what? Despite everything, I love this film. And now I'm going to try and explain to you why I love it. It's directed by Roy Ward Baker, who was a veteran of Hammer horror films and horror movies. A really good director. You know, he made Quatermass in the Pit. What's he doing making this? Oh well. But what's interesting about this film is that Roy Ward Baker actually tries to introduce some quality into it. It's a very schizophrenic movie, right? So the 3 stories, they're all by Chetwynd Hayes, and they all have a theme that links them. And the theme is a monster having a relationship with a human, where the monster is seen sympathetically, right? That's carried through the whole film. It's thought through. So in the first story, you have this monster called a shadmock that has this whistle. It's a fatal whistle that can kill people or turn them into mush, right? And this couple, this young couple, they think he's just this lonely aristocrat and they're going to steal his stuff. So they inveigle the wife, the lovely Barbara Kellerman, so beautiful. They inveigle her into his house and he wants to marry her, but all she wants to do is grab his goods. And eventually the shadmock realises what's happening and turns on her. Then we get the second story, which is just unsalvageable. It's just this comedy thing where there's a vampire, he's married to Britt Ekland, they've got a son who's getting bullied at school, and then they've got this police squad are after him, police squad who specialise in vampires. It's terrible. The third story is the classic tale where there's a film director and he's looking for a location for a horror movie. And he goes off into the countryside, he drives up the motorway, and he takes the proverbial turn off the motorway to a remote village, and it's full of ghouls. They've taken over the village. And one of the ghouls is a hoomgoo. She's a combination of what happens when a human and a ghoul get together. Wonderfully played by Leslie Dunlop. She was a rising actress at the time. Those people who are as old as me will remember Leslie Dunlop. She was in everything. And everyone thought she was going to be a great star, but it never quite happened for her, even though she was actually a really good actress. And so she hooks up with this film director to try and stop the ghouls from killing him. So in each story, you've got a relationship between a monster and a human, and the monster is seen sympathetically. So there's a thought about theme, you know. What's also interesting about this movie, though, is that Roy Ward Baker directs the 3 segments completely differently. You'd think a different director had taken on each part. The film it's so schizophrenic, right? So there's a lot of thought has gone into it from Roy Ward Baker. The first story, the Shadmock story, it's directed a bit like a Hammer House of Horror episode. It's quite baroque. You know, it has this very fancy waltzing sequence where on the eve of his wedding, the Shadmock invites all his friends round and they have this endless waltz. And, it's got that kind of sort of slightly cheap, that slightly gothic feel of Hammer House of Horror. The second story, it's like Grange Hill meets, a Hammer Horror Dracula movie. So it's all very sort of over the top and, we're having fun here. Here's a joke. Here's another terrible gag. But it's all filmed outside really basic, obvious, down-to-earth London locations, like a really crappy comprehensive school, It's a really odd mix. It's like Grange Hill does Dracula sort of thing. But then the third story, it's like Roy Ward Baker actually says, hey, let's make a proper horror film here. And it actually has a genuinely haunting kind of eerie feel about this village. He makes an unusual decision that After showing this film director going out to find a location, the actual village is actually shot in studio. A bit like that, is it Hotel City of the Dead with Christopher Lee in 1960? It's got that kind of feel about it. It's kind of similar looking village. And it's actually quite genuinely eerie and effective. The most impressive thing about this story, though, is a really interesting decision that Roy Ward Baker makes with his direction. At one point, the film director goes into this disused church and he finds the diary of the sexton, which tells the story of the village, right? So it's a flashback to how these ghouls slowly took over the village. And Baker tells this story purely through, like, book illustrations, these beautiful images, which are genuinely evocative and haunting. It's the scariest part of the film. And the way that they're used with music is really, really effective. I think it's a really interesting choice. You know, Baker's trying different things here. A whole story just told through book illustrations. There's also something else that Roy Ward Baker does that's really interesting. This is a film of music, right? We keep going back to this club and we keep having rock songs. And so Roy Ward Baker's thought about this. And so he thinks about the music in the different segments, and they're all very different musically. So the first segment, the sort of Hammer House of Horror segment with the Shadmock, is all classical music. Fauré is used. Strauss is used, the waltz, right? In the second segment, the comedy segment, which isn't funny at all, he has lots of violins, a sort of almost gypsy feel to it. It's all very sort of light and bouncy. And then in the third segment, he introduces electronic music. I think I've discovered it's by Alan Hawkshaw, though people out there might correct me on that. And it's actually really effective. I like electronic music scores anyway, and this is a really good one. Particularly, you know, when the film director turns off to the village, this little sign saying to the village, and the music there is really good. It's really atmospheric and effective. So weirdly, in this really terrible movie, Roy Ward Baker has made some really interesting decisions to try and make these stories very distinctive from each other and stand out. And you think, what's going on here? A really terrible idea for a movie with shockingly little effort made in the club scenes. And there's a really good director, Roy Ward Baker, actually trying to introduce some quality. And it gives the movie a really queasy feel so that it stays with you, more than many sort of respectable horror movies. And ultimately, I think what I like about this movie is I like that weird atmosphere. And it's like the club itself, the Monster Club. The Monster Club is a place separate where monsters go and no one else goes, and they can just enjoy themselves in their own way. And the Monster Club, the movie, is like that for horror fans. It's a special place for us to go, and we can enjoy it, and we understand why everyone else enjoys it. And anyone else watching the movie would think, this is crap. This is a monster of a movie. But we watch it, and there's something kind of comforting about it. It's something like it's like an old jumper, you know, or an old blanket. And we know why we like it, even though we can see it's rubbish. And that's why I really love this movie. So if you've got some time this weekend, you get away from the rallies, stick it on, the Monster Club. You'll love it. Join me there, and we'll have a glass of blood together. But that's not all, my friends, because just as I was putting this video to bed, I happened to come across another of one of the worst films ever made that I also happen to quite like. It's another horror film, and it's called Revenge of the Blood Beast, or known in America as The She-Beast. Now, this film is of particular interest to horror connoisseurs. The reason is because it's the first film made by Michael Reeves. Now, that name may be familiar to some of you. Michael Reeves made two really great British horror films in the late 60s. One is called The Sorcerers with Boris Karloff, and the other is Witchfinder General with Vincent Price. I mean, these two movies, they're Bibles for me in the horror genre. And then Michael Reeves died very young, at the age of 26, under rather strange circumstances. Some people think he committed suicide, some people think he had an overdose, whatever. Now, for years, his first film, the first of 3 films that he made, eluded me, and I finally got to see it a couple of weeks ago, Revenge of the Blood Beast. Now, I had been told that this was a terrible movie, right, that you couldn't see any of Michael Reeves in it. It was nothing like The Sorcerers and Witchfinder General. Now, At the beginning, it certainly seems that way. It's got a very cliched story, okay? Witch, in the old days, the 1600s, she gets tormented and persecuted by the villagers and killed, and she vows to come back to life and kill them all. Pure cliche, right? On top of that, someone made the strange decision in the scripting that the film should be set in modern-day Transylvania, right, in modern-day Romania. And it makes a lot of gags and jokes about this English couple played by Ian Ogilvy and Barbara Steele, and they're going through the Romanian countryside on honeymoon during the communist era. And there's lots of gags about how terrible Romania is. You know, they stay at this inn and it's run by this sort of groping, you know, lascivious man who's sort of drooling over Barbara Steele and watching them have sex through the window. And the local police chief is a complete idiot. And they're all sort of incompetent and or horrible. It's all this kind of black comedy about how crap communist Romania is. And then, just when the witches come back to life and she's killing everyone in sight, interestingly in this movie, it's not a supernatural movie as such, because the witch doesn't kill people through, you know, hypnotizing them or supernatural powers. She hacks them to death with a sickle. That's some of Michael Reeves' later penchant for violence there. But anyway, enough. So she's coming back to life and she's killing all these villagers. And then, just when you're going to get to the climax where Ian Ogilvy and this other guy are going to, you know, get her, it turns into a comedy. And they have this 10-minute car chase where Ian Ogilvy and this other guy, I'll tell you, is Van Helsing, right? They've got the witch in the back of a van and they're being chased by the local police force. And this comedy sequence goes on for about 10 minutes. It's like something out of a Richard Lester film, right? And it completely kills the climax of the movie. The whole last 20 minutes of the film is just terrible. It's just a complete waste of time. Then, you know, they kill the witch, somehow. Then Barbara Steele comes back to life, but she's got a weird smile on her face, so she might still be the witch. And then it's the end. What the hell happened to the movie? That's the bad version. So why am I talking about this movie? Well, the thing is, I think every horror fan, every horror aficionado, particularly if you like Michael Reeves, you should watch this movie. Why? Because this is certainly not the piece of Euro trash that he had to make to get to make The Sorcerers. No. Anyone who loves Michael Reeves' film, you will be able to see Michael Reeves all the way through this picture, right? The opening sequence is extraordinary. This is a debut sequence by a young filmmaker. He's barely in his 20s at this point, right? It is a superb piece of atmospheric filmmaking. So what happens is, you get the opening credits, right? Typical opening credits, blood writing on a piece of stone. And then it says, we're now going to set this story in modern-day Transylvania. What's the first thing you see? A yellow vintage car. That shows the wit and the genius of Michael Reeves straight away. So you're thinking, what's going on? Are we in the 20s? Are we in the modern day? What's going on? This vintage car pulls up outside a property. This kind of old gentleman gets out. He goes up to this sort of gate, pulls open the gate, and then goes into his property. And his property is a cave. He's just living in this cave. So immediately, there's some brilliant visual weirdness going on here that you just don't find in a typical horror film. The guy starts reading this book, a big book, Van Helsing's, you know, folklore tales. You find out that this guy is a sort of relative of the Van Helsing family, right? So then you go into a flashback about the killing of this witch. Now, if you watch that sequence and know anything about filmmaking, you immediately see Michael Reeves. The use of shots, the use of locations, the pacing, the photography from distance, it's so atmospheric, it's so beautiful. You think, this is a guy who knows what he's doing. This is pure Witchfinder General. It's just like that opening sequence in Witchfinder General, right? Then Ian Ogilvy turns up and Barbara Steele turns up with some slightly naff dialogue. And they're travelling through the Romanian countryside. Now, what's interesting here is this. Witchfinder General is not a supernatural movie. It's a historical drama. And what it's about the persecution of witches at a time when the entire state has lost its grounding, right? We were in the English Civil War, and in this time of violence and anarchy, one man exploits it to satisfy his bloodlust, right, and his sadism. So it's a film about the abuse of power, how one society goes rotten, and how power can be abused and exploited within that system. And what we've got here is, we've got it set in another system, communism, which is also riddled with corruption and problems, and is exactly the wrong kind of society to deal with something supernatural, something evil. Why? Because communism has turned against the church. A key scene in the film is set in a disused church. There's some brains here, there's some thought here. And of course, that's the famous scene, those of you who know the movie, where the witch kills the guy, then flings back the sickle, and it lands on a hammer, so you get the image of the hammer and sickle. It's a joke that it could have gone a bit further. It's just a little gag, actually. But the thing is that this is a schizophrenic movie, because you can see the germs of Witchfinder General here, right? That Michael Reeves is trying to portray a society which is absolutely incapable of dealing with those deeper aspects of human nature like faith and superstition, right? But unfortunately, he's making it at the start of his career. He's a young filmmaker, he just wants to make a movie. And he's working with a producer, Peter Maslansky, and also Mel Wells, his co-writer, who also appears in the movie. And they want to make a more comic film. They want to put some gags in, they want to make it a laugh. And Michael Reeves goes with it. But you can see where Michael Reeves is going. You can see the germs of Witchfinder General in the movie, right? The other way you can see the germs of Witchfinder General is in a really strange scene, right? So, you know, Barbara Steele and Ian Ogilvy stay the night in this horrible hotel run by this really sort of, you know, lecherous bloke. And he looks through the window. Watch how brilliantly that scene is shot, by the way. Ian Ogilvy sees him, runs outside, and punches the living daylights out of him, right? Now, it's supposed to be a comic horror film, but he doesn't just give him a slap. He really smacks him to pieces. There's blood on the wall. And you get this eerie recollection of that final scene, do you remember it, of Witchfinder General, where Ian Ogilvy turns on Vincent Price and hacks him to death. There's something very similar going on. So you think, well, what's going on here? This is supposed to be a comic movie, but what you're seeing is, you're seeing all these elements of Michael Reeves' personality bleeding through. He's making this kind of Eurotrash first movie, it's a kind of comedy movie, but he can't help himself. Already his personality is there, this serious horror personality is coming through. And that's why this is a fascinating movie. It's a bad movie in the sense that it doesn't hold together at all, and it really disappoints at the end. But the elements are fascinating. If you like Michael Reeves, you really must watch it. So that's your double bill this Christmas. Get the relatives out of the way, pour yourself a glass of port, log fire, and watch The Monster Club and Revenge of the Blood Beast. Let me know what you think in the comments after Christmas. And have a great Christmas and a wonderful New Year.